Each month we get delivered to our house a copy of National Geographic. It was a present that my aunt always used to pay for Alan, and even after she died it's continued coming. We're not quite sure who pays for it, but every month it drops through our letterbox. This month, on the cover, is a picture they imagine, or an image of Mary, whom they describe as the most powerful woman in the world. I'm not sure what you saw as you read together that passage from Luke's Gospel, but undoubtedly Mary would not have seen herself in that place. Not as you read through that passage, nor, I'm sure, even by the time she saw her son put to death and rise from the dead. During her lifetime, she was far from the most powerful woman in the world. And when we meet her at this passage in Luke's Gospel, we meet someone who is a teenager. Mary is a teenage girl, very much staying in the sticks. The place where she stays is a long way from Jerusalem, a long way from the centre of Jewish faith. She is there, an ordinary young girl it seems, there in the sticks. What marks her out is the faith that she has, a deep-rooted faith. It's interesting to read through that story that we have in Luke's Gospel and to see what happens as Mary has this appearance from the angels and the way that she responds to that. First of all, as she is troubled. Don't know whether you caught that in verse 29, but unsurprisingly, when Gabriel appears, she is troubled. She doesn't know what's going on. This is not what she would have expected. And then as Gabriel speaks to her, there are questions that arise in her mind. And the big question that's there in verse 34, I'm a virgin. How am I going to have a child? It's interesting that that's the only question that Mary asks. And then from there, we discover Mary in that moment simply trusting in God, placing herself, her life, and all that lies ahead in God's hands, trusting Him. Some questions for you to look over and to think through just now. First of all, where are you in your journey with God? Looking through what happened with Mary as she moved from being troubled to questioning to that place where she was trusting. Where are you? Are you troubled, questioning, or trusting just now? Secondly, Mary doesn't seem to take much persuading. Although she moves through that journey, it doesn't seem to take much for her. Why do you think that was? There's a number of options on the sheet, or you might think of some of your own. And then finally, this question. Do we expect too little of our teenagers and stunt their growth as a result? Here's Mary as a teenager, 14, 15. And yet she is asked to take this on. As you think about that, I'd like you to think about what was asked of you as a teenager and what impact that had on you. Did it help you to grow? Did it stunt your growth? And how should that influence the way that we act with our teenagers? So, some questions for you to explore just now. One of the striking things within this is the way that Gabriel coming is something that comes for Mary totally out of the blue. She couldn't have been expecting this or looking for this. She couldn't have imagined that this would ever happen to her. Perhaps never even happened to anyone in her generation. It comes totally out of the blue. And so often in life we seem to think, well, if something like this could happen to me, then I would know exactly what I should be doing. This is not what usually happens. And I do wonder whether we spend too much time worrying that we will miss out on what God wants us to do. As Mark shared with us on Sunday, he was talking about looking and seeing how God had already used him. Perhaps he hadn't seen it before, but he'd begun to see how God had used his life in his workplace and in different ways. So do we spend too much time worrying that we will miss out on what God wants us to do. I guess my experience is that things become obvious as we remain open, that God takes us a bit at a time, that actually we begin to see the path that God is setting out for us, and He asks us simply to follow that. Very rarely do things come as a bolt out of the blue. This is what happened with Mary, not often with us. The one thing, and the key thing, is remaining open. Open to God's leading and God's guiding, and discovering that He takes us on that journey. So, just a couple of questions. You don't need to spend long on this section. But first of all, as you look back in your life, can you see how God was with you in it? Can you see the way that God has taken you on a journey through your life? Can you see that? Take some time to talk about that. And then the second question, what about looking forward? Remembering what you've talked about the way perhaps that you've seen God in the past, what about looking forward? You'll find on your sheet a line, and at the end of that line, two statements. At one end, relaxed and at peace, looking forward. At the other, confused and uncertain. Put yourself somewhere on that line and talk and share together about where you are just now in your life. As you read through this passage from Luke's Gospel, one of the things that Luke wants us to know and to understand is the way that God has all of this planned out. He tells us, even before the appearance of Gabriel, that Joseph, to whom Mary was betrothed, is a descendant of David. God has this planned out. God had made a promise to David that one of his descendants would be king and would be king forever. And so you begin to see that God has a plan, and He's going to fulfill the promise that He made to David in the child that Mary is to carry. He will be a descendant of David because of Joseph. The promises made to David will be fulfilled. And there are many prophecies in the Old Testament that look forward to the coming of the Messiah. Some of them we explore around Advent. Some of them we explore when it comes to Easter, and so much of what is there in the life, the death and the resurrection of Jesus is actually foretold in Old Testament prophecy. You're going to get a bit of time to share what you know in that and what you understand from that. Don't be concerned if you're saying, I don't know very much. Perhaps it might pique your interest a little to go and to think about it a bit more. Go and Google it, or go and just take up the Bible and take some time to think about it. But undoubtedly, Luke wants us to understand that God has something planned and God is working this out. He's spoken about it already. There are also, though, some things in this passage that are for Mary, for her, that she might know that God is working this out. She is told about Elizabeth, that Elizabeth is pregnant. She's given that message so that she might know and understand that God is at work here in a special way. Although this is a bolt out of the blue, it's part of what God is doing. God has already started. Elizabeth is already expecting a baby. And so Mary is to play her part. There is something that God gives her to encourage her. We'll take a moment to think about whether God is giving you some signs at the moment that would encourage you in what He's called you to. For Mary, though, it's not enough to hear about it. You only have to move on a verse after the ones we read tonight, and it's no surprise that Mary rushes off to see her. Mary rushes off to be with Elizabeth, someone who can encourage her. And so some questions for you just now. First of all, how much of Old Testament prophecy do you know or understand? What are the passages that you can think of? Don't be concerned, as I say, if there aren't too many that you can think of, but it may be something you want to follow up. Secondly, what signs is God giving you just now to encourage you? Elizabeth's pregnancy. is an encouragement to Mary. What is God giving you just now? What signs are there to encourage you? And then finally, just this question. Elizabeth encourages Mary. Who has God put in your path so that you will encourage them and support them just now? Who is there for you to support and encourage? Who has God placed there for you? These are the final three questions this evening as we share together.